So the areas that we're going to focus on today are some of those quick links that were shared earlier. And this PowerPoint, as I mentioned, will be available at the end in that bit.ly link that you have with all of our materials already. So you will have access to all of these links. They're also sites you could just go to ODE's website and search for those as well. We will briefly again touch on the role of a district rep and why that is important to make sure you have the right person in the right place. We will go on a little journey through the IEP document and the required elements of those as well. We'll talk a little bit about measurable goals. We'll do a little mini transportation kind of case study with a couple little question answer pieces. And then our hope is to get into some progress monitoring as well. So the quick links that we will have embedded into the slide deck when you receive this is a link to the operating standards. Ohio's operating standards are the legal guidance that oversee all of special education. It is a document that is pulled right out of the Ohio Revised Code and the Ohio Administrative Code, and all of the requirements under state and federal regulations that school districts in Ohio are expected to follow. It's also important to note that the updates were, the operating standards were updated and took effect as of July 1st, 2023. However, there is not an updated standards book yet. I was told is coming this fall. So considering that fall starts on Saturday, I believe. It's coming up this week, right? Maybe in 2 days, on the 21st, I believe, is when fall starts, and it goes through December. So hopefully by the semester break, we will have that formalized document. We are working internally on our team to try to update those operating standards and do a little bit of a crosswalk and highlight some of those changes. So please keep an eye out for that. I do know that we're going to address that at our first COSES meeting, which is the Central Ohio Special Education Administrators meeting, and that is going to be held on November 10th. There's also a link to universal support materials. Those are universal support materials that are available for you to use for yourself to build your own knowledge and understanding, or to share with your staff as well. To help build an understanding and foundation of the special education process. And then the last one is a link to all the required and optional forms. Remember, required forms are exactly as they are. They're required. And then there are optional forms as well. And those optional forms, many districts choose to use those. However, you are not required to. If you choose to create your own, it is important that you do make sure you have all of the required components in those as well. So what is a district representative? A district representative, a qualification for that is it has to be a person who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of children with disabilities. This individual must also be knowledgeable about the general education curriculum, and they must also be knowledgeable about the availability of resources of the school. It's important to note that in the event that an ETR or IEP team cannot come to a consensus, it is legally the responsibility of the district rep to make a final determination on behalf of the team. Additional requirements of a district rep is to attend and participate in the entire meeting. It's not popping in and signing a document and popping back out. You need to attend and participate in the entire meeting and agree with the contents of the document, the IEP, the ETR, and the manifestation determination. Those are all required meetings that must have a district rep. You must ensure the document is accurate and legally compliant as defined by state and federal regulations, and have the authorization to allocate district fiscal resources for all services and supports outlined in the document. If you are currently servicing as a district rep for your district, I highly encourage you all to make sure that you have a clear understanding that you have access and authority to make all of those types of decisions. You are ultimately the one, if you're signing that document, who is the one that is responsible and will be the primary point of contact if there were any issues that may arise with any of the proceedings in special education. So what is the difference between the district of rep, district of residence, and the district of service? So the district of residence is the district where the parent or guardian's last known address is. Although the majority of our students do live with their parent or legal guardian, That is not always the case, especially for our foster place children or wards of the state. So it will point back for district of residence to wherever the parent's last known address is. If you have a parent who is incarcerated, it does not go to where they are incarcerated, it goes to their last known permanent address. The district of service is the district that is responsible for providing the services to the student with disabilities. However, it is still the responsibility of the district of residence to ensure that the district of service is meeting the needs of their students. So who are the members of an IEP team? You're going to have your case manager. Your case manager is the person, it's typically an intervention specialist, or sometimes it's a speech language pathologist if it is a student who maybe just has identified with a speech and language impairment. They are the one that's going to communicate with all of the individuals who service an individual student. They're going to be the one who makes sure that the progress monitoring is being completed in an appropriate and accurate manner. They're also going to be the one who is writing that updated IEP for the annual review or amending if needed. The parent, guardian, or a surrogate parent are required members of the IEP team. You must have the student starting at age 14 or turning 14 in the life of their IEP. They must be invited to the meetings. Federal government requires age 16. Ohio requires age 14. So that is the legal requirement in Ohio. We cannot make it less than the federal requirements, but we can certainly make it more strict, which is what they've done. Beginning at the age of 18, it is required that the student attends the meeting because they now are the ones sitting in the driver's seat with the transfer of rights of majority. So make sure that we are inviting students to these meetings. You must have an intervention specialist, a general education teacher who is providing general education services to that student, any required related service personnel that are providing services. If you happen to have a paraprofessional who's working with a student, maybe in a one-on-one aid setting or in a self-contained classroom, those are a good idea. They're not required, but they're a good idea to have those individuals. And then any other professionals that may be familiar with the student, such as a case manager from the Board of DD, if you have somebody working from OOD, Ohio Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, anybody who is familiar with the student, any other professionals, they're invited to the meetings as well, if you choose to do so. Remember, anything outside of school staff and personnel must have permission from a parent to engage those other individuals into the meeting. So what does the case manager bring to the meeting? If you remember, the case manager is the individual who's making sure everything is ready to go. They should be bringing the most recent IEP progress report. If we're writing a new IEP, there should be a progress report aligned to the old IEP, sharing where the student was on mastery of their goals and the progress they had made. That information should also be driving forward the new IEP, the development of the new IEP. Please make sure that as well that they're bringing any documents that the parent did not sign prior to the meeting, such as the PRO2, the parent invitation for the meeting, any excusal forms. If you have a team member, such as a related service staff member who may not be able to attend, you need to make sure you have those excusal forms. They should also have a copy of the draft IEP. There is nothing in law that says that there needs to be a draft IEP written prior to the IEP team meeting. However, check with the individual, or as you as administrators have the decision to make of should there be a draft created prior to the meeting, and at what point do you want to make sure a parent has a copy of the draft, clearly marked that it's a draft, so that it will be a team-based decision. The benefits of having that draft ahead of time is ensuring that parents have the chance to read through current progress, be prepared to ask any questions, and it just makes our meetings run much more efficiently. So when we think about all of the sections of the IEP, there are, of the 16 sections, there are 14 that you will see required on every IEP that must be completed. The two areas that may not be completed would be post-secondary transition, section number 5, that starts with students beginning at age 14. They must have transition goals. And then section 16, children with visual impairments. These are students who have significant visual impairments, even despite corrective lenses. So now we're talking about our students who are blind or extremely visually impaired, not just someone who may wear corrective lenses. So on your cover page of your IEP, most of this information will be auto-populated or generated from your student information system put into your special services software, whatever that might be. So make sure when you get this that the information is populating correctly. Is the student's name correct? Does it have the most current address that has been reported to the office? You may at times have parents come in and say to you, well, that's not my address. And that's a great conversation to have to make sure that they are providing the office with updated documents if there has been a change in location. That can also impact who becomes the district of residence as well. The student and parent information may also populate, or the parent information may auto-populate. It's important to note that if your parent information auto-populates, to double check that, because any emergency contacts have the possibility of popping up on there. So make sure you delete anyone who's not there. It's also very important if you have parents who have shared custody, especially if the parents aren't living together, that whoever has educational rights is listed on there. And then if you choose to have the other person as well. Under the meeting information, you will put the date that you're actually meeting. So whatever the actual day is that you are meeting at the time would be important to have in there as well. For the meeting type, remember you're only going to choose one type of meeting. Is it an initial IEP? Is it an annual review? Or is it a review other than an annual review? Is it an amendment? Or is there another reason why that you may be having this IEP team meeting? Your IEP timelines, double check that your ETR completion date and your next ETR date align to the actual ETR documents. Some systems will go ahead and auto-populate those. So it's very important that you make sure that they are correct and they're aligned appropriately. And then make sure the meeting date is correct for that initial or annual IEP meeting. Remember again, it must be the date that you are meeting. There are check boxes. Is the child in preschool? Will the child be 14 before the end of the IEP? Is the child younger than 14 but has a transition plan? You must choose yes or no for all of those. Same thing with is the child a ward of the state? The one for the IEP by the 3rd birthday, you do not have to answer that one. So you could leave that information clear as well, or blank. If you would say, yes, they are a ward of state, it's important to make sure that there is a parent surrogate that would be invited into that meeting. When we think about a surrogate parent, there has been updates into the language in the operating standards that very clarifies that question, that it is the responsibility of the district of residence to secure a surrogate parent when the legal guardian cannot be located despite multiple efforts. So when you think about the need for a surrogate, it goes back to the district of residence is the person. That's a change. It used to say something along the lines of the language of in collaboration with the district of service and district of residence. It is now very clear that is the district of residence. So some districts of service have surrogates that they are very happy to work with. They've worked with them often. And I'm not saying that's not a possibility to do so, but the district of residence has to grant permission to do that and appoint that person. Most of the times, and I'll follow up, most of the time, if you would just contact the district of residence and they say yes, they'd be good, then that's where the documents need to be signed of who's been appointed as the surrogate.
And for a change of placement, do you amend the IEP or hold a review other than renewal?
That would be a determination for the team. So I think a lot of that, if you are just changing placement and maybe you had just done an IEP team or the annual review, you may still want to consider possibly either amending or potentially even rewriting an IEP if you're doing a change of placement. When your least restrictive, your LRE is changing, you may also be needing to add or remove goals depending on what the services look like for that student. But definitely in that IEP team meeting, making those decisions on what that's going to look like.
And just kind of to add to that, always remember, anytime you do a change of placement, you have to get parents' permission for that. They have to sign off on that.
So if you see here on this slide, if you need a surrogate, we do maintain a list within our region of all of the surrogate parents who support any of our schools within our 7-county region. So we are we're Franklin County. Well, we do have Madison and the 6 counties that touch it around. So if you are one of our SST 11 regions, if you contact our office at SST 11 at ESCCO, and that email address will be at the end as well. If you send an email there, we can get you that parent surrogate list. All right, so let's talk about dates. When you think about dates that go on that cover page of the IEP, you're going to hear all different types of guidance. I would definitely defer back to what your legal counsel is directing you to do. However, what you do need to understand is that your meeting date is your meeting date, the end date, and then your start date of your IEP could be the next day. It could be a week later. It depends. That's going to depend upon how soon do you get that prior written notice into the hands of the parents. Some people work on their prior written notice during the meeting, where others wait and do it after the meeting. There's no right or wrong process. It should be consistent within your district, would be my recommendation. I know where I came from as a director, we did not do the prior written notice and even do much to it. We did a little bit of the starting of it before the meeting, but most of it happened after the meeting. I know when Erin and I were talking when she was in a district, they would do it kind of as they went, as their meeting notes. But never should you come into a meeting with a fully prepared prior written notice, because even though it is prior, it's prior to actions taking place. It is not prior to a meeting. It actually gets completed after a meeting, but it's prior to the district providing any services or changing anything. The start date of your IEP comes after that prior written notice. And then the end date of the IEP is 1 day less than your meeting date, not 1 day less necessarily than the start date of the IEP. And you can just add these in the chat, your response here. So if the meeting date is December 22nd, the start date is December 23rd, the end date is December 25th, when would the prior written notice need to be dated?
If does leap day this year affect any dates?
Well, your end date would always be 1 day less than your meeting date. So that shouldn't impact where that would be, unless it would fall on the 28th of February as one of those dates. And then I would just move it back to the 20, or if it was the 29th, move it back to the 28th. All right. So hopefully our group put in December 22nd is when your prior written notice should have been written. For our next one, with the meeting date of May 23rd, 2024, the prior written notice was given to the parents on May 26th. The start date of the IEP was May 27th. When would the end date of the IEP be? So your date should be May 22nd of 2025. For our next one, the prior written notice was given to the parents on June 25th of 2024. Start date was June 26th, 2024. The end date of the new IEP is June 21st, 2025. When would the meeting date be? Hopefully everyone came up with June 22nd of 2024. And our last one, if it is March 24th, 2024 for the meeting date, the prior written notice given to the parents on March 31st of 2024. The end date was March 23rd of 2025. When would the start date of the IEP be? We should have April 1st, 2024.
We have a question. Someone asked, what date do you use for the next IEP review date?
That would be that the end date. You have to have your annual review prior to the end of the IEP. So it depends what your district's practice is. I know the district I left, we typically tried to schedule our meetings at least a month prior to the end of the IEP. That doesn't always work. We did that. We tried to schedule them a month ahead of time to allow for parents to cancel, teachers being sick, school cancellations, and we still had time to reschedule within our legal timeline.
And then we have another question. Is there a general amount of time between the meeting date and the start date?
It comes back to that, when does the prior written notice get in the hands of the parents? So that's the ultimate piece. You have to start the services after you've notified the parents through the prior written notice of when the services will take place. So that's why you'll notice that the prior written notice is one day and the start date is the next day. So if you had the meeting and you know that that parent attended via phone, they don't have email, the student's out sick, and you have to put it in the mail, the US Postal Service, you have to kind of in your head think, oh, it's going to take 3 to 5 days, if you're lucky, to make it through the US Postal Service. So kind of in that head, in that mind, in that thought in your head as you're moving forward. And then you would put that in the prior written notice that we mailed the prior written notice to the parent on whatever day that would be. So there's not a specific schedule. I would highly recommend that you would make that consistent within your district. And then you as administrators would have the opportunity to set that standard.
And then there was a question, is there a general amount of time to send the prior written notice?
As soon as possible, because you can't start the next IEP services until that prior written notice is out. A general rule of thumb is to make sure it is out within 24 hours of the meeting date, because if you don't do that, you have the potential of being out of compliant depending when your previous IEP was set to expire.
And then another question is it considered in the hands of the parent the same day if you email it?
If you could email it to them, as long as you have some way to record that you have provided it to the parent. But I would never encourage you, nor have I heard any legal guidance that suggests that you should have the meeting date and the start date of the IEP be the same day. It should always be the day after the prior written notice has been received. So section 1 of the IEP talks about future planning. One of the largest mistakes we see in future planning is when we talk about what the school wants. Future planning is about what the student's future plans are, not what the school is planning for the student. So what are the students' skills and interests? What are the students' plans for the future? What are the students' plans for future employment, for example? And it must be heavily reliant upon input from the student and parents. We should not be writing in this section, the IEP team or the school team would like. It could be there, but that is not the design behind this section. This section should address the student skills and interests. Are there plans for future education? Make sure it is written in a way for the students. What do they want to see for their future plans? Section 2 looks at those special instructional factors. Remember, all of these need to have a yes or a no. They all must be checked. Any item that is checked yes must be addressed in sections 3, 6, and/or 7. So they have to be addressed somewhere in the IEP. If you choose yes, it must be addressed in the IEP. If behavior is checked, yes, does the child have a behavior which impedes his or her learning or the learning of others? If you have said yes there, then there should be a goal and specially designed instruction to support that behavior, or possibly a separate behavior intervention plan for that student. Section 3 is the profile. So when we look at this profile, this is an example of how you could have your profile set up. A lot of the new software services or software systems that are out there allow as a district to set up some templates. When you think about your profile, the way this looks could look a little bit different for every individual student and within each district, but there are some required elements that you should have in there. You should definitely address the strengths or interests of the child. Using these headers helps to make sure you have all of the areas in place on this document. You should include any relevant background information. So you want to talk about educational history only in that background information, and include any related service support. Although you may have a student who's no longer receiving a related service such as speech, it could be relative to that student, especially if they've later been identified with a specific learning disability, to note that they potentially had specially designed instruction with a related service staff member when they were in elementary school. And maybe the student now is an 8th grader or a freshman. That would be relevant background information. The educational needs of the child summarized from the ETR. It needs to be taken from that educational needs and implications sections of the ETR summary, and it should explain why the IEP team is prioritizing certain areas in the IEP, especially if all areas are not being addressed, including those related services. Keep in mind, it is an ETR summary. It's a summary of the ETR. It is not copy and pasted from an ETR. You should have a description of the student's school day. So what are the areas in that? Oops, sorry about that. When you talk about the description of that student's school day, are they participating in the general education curriculum and instruction? And at what capacity? Are they doing that with an intervention specialist, or are they going into a small group resource setting? Be very clear. This is where you can talk about some of the scheduling for the middle school, high school, and it also should include information about why a student has a schedule in the way he or she has. This is also where you want to address concerns of the parent. These are general concerns, not necessarily specific to one goal. You can 100% request this information prior to the meeting. When you're scheduling the meeting, that would be a great time to ask that question. So you could go ahead and have it in your draft copy. However, it could also be added at the meeting if you were unable to connect with the parent. You should put any state and/or district-wide assessments by their performance levels. Make sure you're being clear with that information. If a student has a RIMP, it must be identified and discussed in the profile section. There is some new guidance coming with RIMPs. If you have not looked at the updated 3rd grade reading guarantee guidance, this year, beginning this year, a parent in 3rd grade has the opportunity to request an exemption from the 3rd grade reading guarantee provision of retention in collaboration with the school, if they choose to do so. And then moving forward, any year that a student is not at grade level or on track, if a student is not on grade level, they are going to have a RIMP. There is a plan to roll out over time, but in a few years from now, there could be students who are on RIMPs all the way through their senior year if they have not closed the gap with their typical peers and are not performing on grade level. You can adjust if address if there's been any extended school year services that have been provided in the past. This is not the extended school year service about this year. This would be talking about any type or duration of the previous IEP team decisions.
Kim, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, ma'am.
So sorry. We're getting some questions in the chat regarding section 2, back on the behavioral box being checked.
Yeah.
One person said past presentations given by legal has stated that you do not have to have a goal for behavior, but it can be addressed through accommodations. Someone else said same. Past guidance has said as long as behavior is addressed, it can be checked yes. For example, accommodations are listed in section 7. On the flip side, if a student has a behavior goal, do we have to check that first box in section 2? And then we were told it could also be addressed in the profile. For instance, if the team determines student no longer needs goals or accommodations, we would outline this in the profile without providing those services in 6 or 7.
So that last one, and we can confirm on what the legal guidance will suggest for that, for the first 2, because they sounded very similar. But the last one says that there's a need identified, but they're not. Can you read that last one again?
Yes, ma'am. We were told it could also be addressed in the profile. For instance, if the team determines the student no longer needs goals or accommodations, we would outline this in the profile without providing those services in 6 or 7.
Yeah, so if you look right here at what we have on this slide, I went back, it says if it's checked yes, it must be addressed in sections 3, 6, and or 7. So 3 is the profile section that you could address it there. It's not 3, 6, and 7.
And then someone wrote, how do you know if a RIMP should stay in a student's profile?
If they have a RIMP, whatever your policies are within your district to write RIMPs. If the student has a RIMP, it must be in their profile section. That's why on the next up here it says right on the required document. That's not our language. It says child's profile to include reading improvement and monitoring plan if applicable. So if a student has one, it must be addressed in their profile section.
And I just kind of wanted to piggyback on the behavior thing. When I was a director of special ed, our legal and anything that I've ever been to and anything that I've ever been taught is if you check yes to that behavior question in section 2, you must have a behavior goal or a BIP in place. And on the flip side, if you have a behavior goal or a BIP in place, you must check that box in section 2. We can double check that for you, or you can check with your legal counsel, but I've never heard anything different than that. When were RIMPs required to be listed in the profile section? In a while.
I was a director of special ed for 5 years before I've been here, so at least for the last 7.
Yeah.
That's been on this required document as long as I was a director of special education. When that 3rd grade reading guarantee came out, I believe that's when it got added to the IEP. So that's not anything new. The only new guidance coming out about the RIMPs is that parents could request an exemption from the guarantee after the student has taken the assessment. Because if they haven't taken it, they can't exempt to not test. Ohio's not a test optional state. That would be just the retention provision.
Are there certain eligibility categories that require behavior goals?
I don't believe there's anything that mandates that. It's your ETR data that's going to drive. It's your ETR that's going to drive what's in your IEP. So if you did a behavior assessment and you have documentation of behaviors, then that must be addressed in your IEP.
If a 3rd grade student is on a RIMP but achieves the promotion score for the 3rd grade reading guarantee, does the RIMP continue following that student or does it go away?
So now we're trending into all the literacy components of the 3rd grade reading guarantee. So I'm going to defer back to that because that's not an IEP specific piece. It's just that this would be documented. So we will need to look at that updated RIMP, 3rd grade reading guarantee guidance. But if I recall correctly, and that's why I'm saying I need to look at the guidance. If I recall correctly, that they're on a RIMP until they are evaluated based off whatever your district standards are, until they're no longer there. Morgan, do you know the answer to that one off the top of your head?
So the question is, when can they come off the RIMP?
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that once that plan is in place, if you are observing data in your class or in the student's class that suggests that they no longer need the RIMP, you can take them off of that RIMP. But in terms of EMIS purposes, I believe it is not updated until that next date that information is pulled.
Look at that. We do have some upcoming literacy professional development pieces coming as well through SST 11. So that might be some good information or some of those to look at.
And then it looks like there's just one more question in here. Does the designation from the ETR get listed in the profile in that summary?
Check with your legal counsel on what they want with that. My legal counsel, when I was in a district, did think we should put those in there, but I've also heard other legal counsel who say don't. So that would be one I would defer to your legal counsel on that one. Section 4 talks about extended school year services. It's really important that you leave this blank until the meeting. Do not predetermine. It is an IEP team decision if extended school year services will be offered. So you'll answer that question. Has the team determined that extended school year services are necessary? The answer would either be yes or no. And if yes, what goals is it that the student is not making progress on that they could not recover or recoup that information in a timely manner that would need to be addressed? And then will the team need to reconvene to collect further data, and will the team need to collect further data and reconvene to make a determination? That answer should either be yes or no. How you choose to do that within your district, that is going to be your choice as far as that goes. I know as a former director, and so since we're talking to all the administrators here today, for my own planning purposes, any students that we needed to reconvene to discuss extended school year services, I would always choose a date. I usually chose a date sometime like late April for us, which gave me about a month before school was out, that we could get that meeting to come back together and determine if we needed to have extended school year services, as well as what that might look like for that student. I waited until close to that summer break. There's no right or wrong as far as what that is. It's just whatever your district is. The more consistency you as an administrator can build within your department, the more that you're going to be able to manage and make sure that you're meeting all of your timelines and your legal obligations. And remember that if they've had extended school year in the past, it does not mean that they get extended school year this year. It's always an annual decision and it must be reviewed annually. The post-secondary transition. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, but not a lot of time on this one. Because we do have a professional development coming up October 3rd related specifically to this, because there is a lot to post-secondary transition. I will put the little alert out there from what we are hearing from ODE, or soon to be the DO. For those of you who are unaware, the Ohio Department of Education is becoming the Department of Education and Workforce. And it's now becoming a cabinet level position instead of run by the State Board of Education. So you can look up what those shifts are, but they are looking to add more to this post-secondary transition component of the IEP and updating the IEP document. I don't know when that will happen, but I do know that's something being discussed. So post-secondary transition, section 5 must be completed for all students who are going to be 14 or older during the life of the IEP. So if you have a 13-year-old student who will be turning 14 before the expiration of this new IEP, number one, they should be invited to the meeting. And number two, they must have post-secondary transition goals. So you must make sure that you have both of those in place for any of your students who will be 14 or older in the life of the IEP. There are 3 different goals that you need to look at writing for your students for post-secondary transition. There's post-secondary training and education, competitive integrated employment, and independent living. The independent living does say as appropriate. However, the part I would like to say about this, in my personal opinion, and the multiple people I've talked to in this component, unless they are already living 100% independent, which means they have their own home or apartment or whatever, they have their own vehicle, they're working, they're doing all of those things independently, there are skills we can teach our students to become independent adults. So when it says as appropriate, you really need to think about what that appropriate looks like for that individual student. When you write the goal, and then you have to have age-appropriate transition assessments, not just a student wants to. What are those age-appropriate assessments? There are on the CI toolkit. And so if you get our newsletter, if you go to sst11.org, you can sign up to get our newsletter. There will be some information coming out here soon about how to access the CI toolkit. If you've never seen it, it's on ODE's website. There are free age-appropriate transition assessments there that have been vetted by a state work group of people all throughout Ohio, that they are valid and reliable assessments on there, as well as many different transition activities that you could use to make sure that you are truly meeting the needs of our individual students. When you talk about the numbers of the goals that you're linking those to, what are the goals and the annual goals in section 6, the measurable annual goals that are going to be covered by that post-secondary transition?
Kim, I'm going to jump in real quick. Hopefully connection. That's why my camera's off. I would also, there was a question in the chat about getting parent consent for age appropriate transition assessments. And yes, that is true. If it's an assessment that you're giving to a child that you're not giving to everyone, you should have informed parent consent. Do that. Do you have to have a formal consent form signed? Not necessarily. What I would also recommend is in your IEP for the activities that you're listing, write out that the activities are going to include providing age-appropriate transition assessments. That way, next year, you'll be doing those age-appropriate transition assessments because it's part of the actual IEP plan.
Thank you, Erin. This next slide just talks about those age-appropriate transition assessments. So when you do that, the AATA, it will help you identify they're not in the normal order we see with your PINs, the preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. Then you would write those post-secondary, measurable post-secondary goals related to those. Identify what those transition services look like. I'll link that to your current course of study that are linked to your annual IEP goals, and then helping students coordinate those services with adult agencies as needed. So section 6, the measurable annual goals. When we look at our measurable annual goals, we want to look at those present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Most people still call those the PLOP. It's much easier to say than the PLAP if you would actually put all those letters out. So those present levels of performance, that's what we're looking for. We would also be looking at, this is where you will be putting your measurable annual goal, how you're going to measure the progress towards the annual goal, and what are your objectives or benchmarks to meet your goal. So when we talk about our present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, otherwise known as the PLOP, that should have your detailed summary of current daily academic, behavioral, functional performance. This is the information regarding the skills of the child. You need to have information in there in regards to the progress towards their past goals and objectives. You need to address how the disability affects progress in the general education curriculum, the effective classroom strategies, accommodations, and/or interventions, what that progress is in the general education curriculum in relation to same-age peers, or what is that gap between the child and some of those same-age peers? What is the measurable baseline data that will link with the goal? Why are you writing the goal? Be clear. Where is the data from that progress report, that most recent progress report that's driving this new goal? And then parent input with regards to this area. So what are the IEP goals and objectives? What's the parent input in relationship to that, which is different than the parent input that we talked about, generally speaking, earlier in the profile section. When you look at your measurable annual goal, it must be related to the areas that are described in the PLOP, or the present levels of academic achievement. You need to name the student, what that student will be able to do. So don't say he, her, or the student. Actually use the student's name. What are they going to be able to do? Are they going to increase? Are they will be able to? To what degree or level? Are they going to do it 80% of the time? Are they going to do this on 2 out of 3 trials? Under what conditions? So what is the situation, setting, or materials? In what length of time? For example, for your goal, you could say by the end of the IEP. And how will that progress be measured? Will it be a work sample, a rubric, short cycle assessment? Make sure you're clear on how you're collecting that data. You should see quantitative data, those numbers in these areas. Avoid terms like seldom or never or often. So what are your methods for measuring progress? You can use a curriculum-based assessment, portfolios, observations, anecdotal records, short cycle assessments, performance assessments, checklists. I'm going to skip running records and I'll tell you why in a moment. Work samples, inventories, or rubrics. Keep in mind, when I go back to the observations, if you choose to an observation, that's an informal visual assessment of student learning. It has beginning and ending times, and they're often filled out on a specific form, checklist, or data collection form. And it has to be completed from an outside observer. So if you're choosing to do an observation as one of your methods for measuring progress, there has to at least be 2 adults involved in this. One is going to be the adult who is providing instruction in whatever setting that is. And there's going to be another adult that is just there to observe. So if you choose that, which you can, it's allowable to do so, understand what the requirements of the law are to do that. Same thing with anecdotal records. When you think about an anecdotal record, they are a written observation, word for word, action for action, of exactly what a child is doing and saying. It's kind of like a transcript of an event. So think about that if you were collecting an anecdotal record. Think about you being a recorder and literally everything that is happening. They're very similar to the observation, but they're much more detailed. We're not saying don't do those. We're saying you need to understand the implications if you choose to do that. When you think about running records in a literacy component, and you think about how you're tracking and monitoring reading, and you talk about that 3 cueing system under the new guidance that's coming out with the 3rd grade reading guarantee and all the dyslexia facilitation and the dyslexia legislation coming out, Ohio has now put a ban on the 3 cueing system to being used for reading instruction. Yes, there is some qualifications or some waivers for students with disabilities, but those are very specific and they would have to be very, very clearly and articulately written into an IEP. So with the shift in the dyslexia legislation, that idea of running records in a literacy piece are going to be going away in the way that we have traditionally used those.
Kim, someone has asked if they need to get parental permission before observing a student.
If you already had a parent sign off on observations as you're measuring progress at your previous IEP, they're signing that that's the way you're collecting your data. So unlike an observation for an ETR that does require a different level of signature, the parent has already signed off on this IEP and they know you're collecting this data in this manner. So if you're just wanting to do an observation that's not already documented in the IEP, then yes, you should get parent consent, but the parents are consenting to this IEP as your method of progress or measuring progress. So we're just going to look here at a couple goals. And I'm watching our time to make sure that we try to get through as much as we can today. So I may skip over a couple of our scenarios. So I just want you to read through this goal and think about all of the required elements of this goal. And I just want you to type in the chat, yes or no. Given an end of 4th grade reading passage, Paul will orally read the selection at a rate of 100 words per minute with 95% accuracy on 3 passage timings by the end of the school year as measured by a curriculum-based assessment. So just type in there yes or no. So this answer would be yes, this would be a measurable goal. It does contain all of the components of a measurable goal. Here's your next one. Given a passage read aloud to her, the student will answer 3 out of 4 comprehension questions as measured by work samples. And I'm hopeful in our chat, most people are typing. If not everyone has typed no. We are missing the who. First of all, we don't know who her is referring to. We also don't know to what level or of degree, and we also don't have a length of time in this one. Given 5 opportunities for social interaction with peers during non-academic activities, Beth will initiate conversation 90% of the time on 3 consecutive weekly observations by the end of the IEP as measured by inventories. So this one would also be a yes. And then our last one. Given a 7th grade writing prompt, Joe will complete a paragraph with a topic sentence, supporting evidence, and a conclusion with 100% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials by the end of the IEP year. For this one, hopefully we put the answer as no, because we don't know how the goal is going to be measured. What is the measurement tool? How are we going to collect that data? Section 7 are the descriptions of specially designed services. So the IEP must specify the special education services related and or other support services that are needed to implement the goals and objectives. If there's more than one service to be provided for the goal, it needs to have its own separate box. For example, a speech language pathologist may work in a small group in the classroom, and then they may work one-on-one in a therapy room. You would need to designate where those services and how they're taking place. You must have a begin and end date, and the begin and end date match the service. They are not always 100% of the time the exact same beginning and ending date of the IEP. So when someone asks that question, if we identify a new service to come on, or maybe we've gone through an evaluation and we're removing a service, those beginning and end dates would look different. For the amount of time of instruction will be given towards the implementation of the goals listed, not the amount of time in a class period or an instructional period. So make sure that you're actually documenting for that amount of time, what that's going to look like. And then your frequency of service, that needs to be aligned with your amount of time. You could say that it's listed your amount of minutes per a 5-day week or per a 4-week month. It is recommended to definitely not use quarterly or semester for anything, including your related service. Everything should be weekly or monthly. And then there is a lot of guidance around as well that is suggesting to not use daily as well, because if you are out, not you, I'm sorry, but if your staff is out or the student is out, you now have to make up those individual daily minutes. So your legal counsel may choose to direct you in a different way, a different manner, but our recommendation would be to use either weekly or monthly. Make sure you also classify the amount of time. You don't want to just say 100 per week, because somebody could say, well, I want 100 hours per week. Make sure you're being very clear in what that is going to look like. When you talk about your specially designed instruction, there should not be a one-stop shop for everything. Everybody shouldn't have the same SDI. They need to be organized and planned instructional activities. They need to be provided by a special education professional, such as an intervention specialist or a related service provider. They need to adapt to the needs of the individual child as appropriate, the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction. It must address the unique needs of that child, and it needs to ensure the child has access to the general education curriculum or extended standards. Keep in mind, those extended standards are only designed for a very small group of students. The majority of all students should be working towards the general education. So Ohio's learning standards is what they should be aligned to. And they need to meet the educational standards that apply to all children. You should not use quarterly or semester. Reason being that comes up. If you were to say, if you think about a quarter, and we see this most often with our related service staff, right? That they might say, well, quarterly, I'm going to provide 300 minutes. They would be compliant to provide all 300 minutes within 1 or 2 days. Technically, that would be compliant. That is not a good practice, and that has the potential to get you into trouble by doing so. I say potential because it depends how the parent would interpret it, and it would depend on if any due process or anything of that nature were filed. Best practice is to do weekly or monthly. OEC, if they come in and do an internal monitoring, they will have findings related to quarterly or semester. So you need to be getting that language out.
Someone is asking about transition goals. Can we use quarterly?
I would still not recommend doing anything quarterly from all the guidance I've had working with the Office of Exceptional Children. Is that what you have seen as well, Talia? I know you are a little bit more well-versed, you and Aaron both in transition than I.
Yeah, I would definitely, I would just stay away from quarterly altogether. Weekly is definitely good. I think monthly provides a little bit better best practice, just because then that provides for holidays, days off, the child being absent. I just think that protects you a little bit better using monthly, but I would definitely not use quarterly.
So when we move into assistive technology, you need to remember that assistive technology is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether it's acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized. Its proprietary name should never be used. So please do not put for assistive technology that a student will use the LAMP system on an iPad, because a district may not have an iPad. However, they may have another electronic device. They may have something else other than LAMP that's a comparable product, Or a student may not do well on an iPad and need to go to a more low-tech text system. And so if the IEP says they have to use those proprietary items, that is all that you're able to use. So make sure that you're being clear in what the expectation is. However, make it broad enough without a specific title of any of those in there. A surgically implanted device is not assistive technology. So if a student has something like a cochlear implant, that is not assistive technology. That is not what the student or the school is providing for the student. It may have a student under their medical needs say that they have a cochlear implant, and the assistive technology might be some kind of an FM system to be able to make the sound louder for the student who is hard of hearing. That would be the assistive technology being provided by the district. And although on the IEP box, it does have a time and frequency, that part does not have to be filled in, because we do understand that assistive technology can look different. And I do want to go back to those items. If you have a student who is using a calculator on classroom assessments and you want them to have access to it on a state assessment for a section of a test, for example, 5th grade, on the state 5th grade math assessments, they can use a calculator on one section, but not on the other. If it is not in their IEP, they cannot use it on the non-calculator portion. If it is in their IEP, you do need to list that under assistive technology, because a calculator is not provided to all students. So we're not just thinking about big, expensive equipment pieces. It could be low tech, it can be high tech. What is that assistive technology that is different for the student whose needs you're servicing? When we talk about the accommodations and the modifications, accommodations provide a different way for children with disabilities to take in information or communicate their knowledge back to others. Accommodations are adjustments to make sure children with disabilities have equal access to the curriculum and a way to be successful. These changes, remember, do not alter or lower the standards or expectations for a subject or test. The child is still expected to know the same material and answer the same questions as fully as the other children. The difference between the accommodation and the modification is that modifications mean changing in what is being taught or expected from the child. That modification or change means the child will not be doing the same level of work as the other children and will not be expected to master the same academic content as others in the classroom. This is generally used for those students with the low incidence disabilities.
Kim, there are a couple questions that came in. Sorry, going back to assistive technology. Do they need to specify if it's a handheld calculator?
I don't think so, because now you're bound to it being a handheld calculator, and maybe in that classroom they just have access to one that's plugged in, or an overhead or something larger, depending on what that student's need is.
The next one is, how do you recommend a parent-provided assistive technology device? Would you recommend that we do not put it in there unless we recommend this? Would you recommend placing it in the profile if it is parent-provided?
So I would definitely document in the prior written notice that the team considered to provide assistive technology and that the parent is choosing to provide that. I would get that in your prior written notice. You don't want to put anything in the IEP that binds the parent to be the responsible party to provide things. You could put into that profile section if a parent is choosing to provide their own, for example, an iPad or whatnot. You could put that in the profile section under that parent input. Would be my recommendation for that.
Can you define the difference between specially designed instruction, accommodations, and assistive technology? For example, I've had teachers argue that a graphic organizer should be in all three of these areas.
Specially designed instruction is how the student is being instructed. We don't instruct a graphic organizer. That's a tool. So your graphic organizer would fall into that accommodation. I would not see that as being an assistive technology piece, because every student has access to a graphic organizer.
I agree. Is a reduction of 50% less problems to solve in a given homework assignment an accommodation or a modification? Also, reducing answer choices from 4 to 3, an accommodation or modification?
That is a really good question. So when you get into that idea of what is it doing, is it changing the expected outcome for a student for them to demonstrate knowledge? Are they having different expectations of what's coming from that? So when you think about how you're making those changes, I think that's going to become the question on what you're doing during that, whether it becomes an accommodation or it becomes a modification. Is it lessening the complexity of the course? If so, it's a modification. If it is not lessening the complexity of the information, then it would be an accommodation.
Someone asked, is a calculator considered AT or should it be placed under accommodations?
A calculator would be assistive technology because that's a tool that's being used. So assistive technology is a tool. It's a tool that's being used by a student when other students are not granted access to that tool. I think you could also put it as an accommodation that they're allowed to have that with them, but I would definitely put it in the assistive technology.
And I think we're good.
All right. So support for school personnel. Support for school personnel are those specific supports or training necessary for school personnel to provide FAPE, that free appropriate public education. If more than one service is listed, a service box for each support must be completed. The most important piece to this is that it documents the needs that are supporting adult to adult. This is not about an adult to a student. This is adult to adult. So for example, you may have support for school personnel and have your physical therapist who is working with the other adults on appropriate and safe transfers for a student to get in and out of a wheelchair. That would be support for school personnel. So there is a trained provider providing that support for other adults. So keep in mind, that one's really important. It is a service from adult to adult interaction. When we talk about services to support medical needs, these are medical services that the child needs to receive FAPE. It may or may not be tied to specific goals, and it may also include school health services and school nurse services. So it could include, it doesn't necessarily have to, it's going to be individualized. Remember, these are IEPs, individualized education programs. Medications that must be dispensed during the day, and medical service such as intermittent catheterization, feeding tube, or breathing therapies. Those would be services to support medical needs.
We have someone with their hand raised. Michelle has her hand raised.
Hi, I am asking, going back to the personnel support. I am in the preschool world, and we do get a lot of support from our OTs and PTs in guidance to, maybe sensory input or, obviously, PT may say something simple like, hey, can you kind of give him a verbal of heel to toe when he's walking down the hallway because he needs that verbal reminder. So you're saying any sort of interaction between the teacher and the support or the related service should be listed?
No, it would be more of like that instruction, like that safety or skills. It wouldn't be necessarily individualized strategies like that. Like being able to just come up to you and say, remind them to do heel to toe, because you're not providing that instruction per se, you're just providing those reminders. But if you were to do a transfer from a wheelchair to a changing table for a student in a wheelchair to be able to know to have diapering or whatnot, there are very specific trainings that a PT would need to provide to the other staff members for safety measures.
Okay. All right. So we use this a lot for OTAs and PTAs. So that would be a correct way to use that. So like if a PT is writing the IEP, the PTA is going to do the services, correct?
And yeah, the PTA is going to do the services. So under support for school personnel, it would be your PT guiding your PTA.
Correct. Right. Okay. Just making sure.
Good question. And that actually kind of leads in a little bit.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
There are a couple other questions about support for school personnel in the chat.
Mhm.
Where do we put aid supports to assist a student with transitions?
So if it is, there is actually an aid services section on the IEP that you would identify the aid specific services if that is an aid to a student. If you would have, for example, in a classroom, such as like an ED classroom, and you had paraprofessionals assigned to that classroom to support the students, that would be support for school personnel because the intervention specialist is guiding the paraprofessionals who are then providing supports to the students. So that would be the adult to adult, the intervention specialist to the paraprofessional in that classroom setting. If it's a one-on-one aid service, that would go into the aid services in the IEP document.
Or physical therapists to support gross motor skills through small group PE class?
So the question with that comes, if they're doing a small group PE class, is that APE? If that's APE, that's a related service, adapted physical education. That would be a related service, not the support for school personnel is adult to adult. So is the physical education teacher supporting the general education teacher on those skills? So it's adult to adult. If the physical education teacher is providing services to a student, it goes in other areas.
If you put aid and related services, can you leave the minutes blank?
No, your related services must have minutes. The only thing you can leave without minutes is assistive technology.
Where is the aid services document you're referring to?
I can't get into all of my documents right now because I have my only screen up on this. So we will put that in there and I'll put I'll clarify. I'll try to put another slide in if you can remind me of that to my team, to my fellow colleagues, and we'll put a slide in about the aid services when we get this document out to you. I will write it on my little note here right now. So I'll just add a whole slide about aid services that we'll put in here. So you'll have that information for everybody.
I'll go ahead and answer this next question while you're doing that. Someone's asking, where is the aid services section on IEP? That's under section 7. There should be a drop down and aid services is on there, but remember that's if it's a one-to-one aid for the child.
And like I said, we'll put a whole slide into this about aid services and hopefully clarify the questions related to that as much as
And
we
then I'm not sure if this next one's a question or a statement. It just says it is not adaptive PE because they do not have an adaptive PE license.
So it comes back then if it's the physical therapist that is providing services, then it would be physical therapy services. If the physical therapist is instructing the PE teacher, I think that's where we're coming back to, then that's support for school personnel from the physical therapist to the physical education teacher. However, physical therapy and APE are not the same thing. So you need to make sure that if a student has a need for APE, then the school is legally obligated to provide that in some capacity. So when we talk about, can a general education teacher and or a substitute provide specially designed instruction? That is a question that's asked all the time. Okay. The law is written that it is absolutely 100%. It is not best practice for a general education teacher and or a substitute teacher to provide SDI. However, what we do know, especially in substitute teacher pieces of that, is there is a shortage, right? Or there might be an intervention specialist who goes out on maternity leave, or there might be an intervention specialist who needs to go out on extended medical leave. Keep in mind, this is not best practice and should only be used in specific situations. You still are going to follow the same guidelines that we did before regarding support for school personnel. And now you're going to add the intervention specialist into support for school personnel. So this other box I have where the font doesn't match and there's highlighted, I took literally this slide information directly from a meeting I was in last week from ODE. Now it's related to career tech. It doesn't matter. You could take out the career tech instructor and you could put general education in there. You could put substitute teacher. The general education teacher can assist in the delivery of SDI, but the SDI must be overseen by an intervention specialist. So you cannot just put in the IEP that a general education teacher alone is going to provide specially designed instruction, because it is very clear in both the federal and the state law that it must be provided by a special education professional. A general education teacher is not a special education professional. The SDI section on the IEP would indicate that the special education teacher is the responsible party. And then down in the supports for school personnel, so if we use general education teacher instead of the career tech teacher, it could say the general education teacher will collaborate with and support the intervention specialists in assisting with the delivery of specially designed instruction. So you may use that language as well if you had to put a license or a long-term sub in a position. You may need to use that language if you have unlicensed teachers serving in that special education capacity. The law is very, very clear that specially designed instruction needs to be provided by a licensed special education professional. So I have worked with a district in a couple different capacities. And the idea of like a VOCE has also been taken out of the language when you talk about career tech planning district schools as well. Those CTPDs, those VOCEs are gone. And so now how does the intervention specialist who is servicing in that career tech provide any of those SDIs? It would be in collaboration with the intervention specialist.
Okay, so the first one is, if we have been operating this way since the start of the school year, but did not put it in the support for school personnel, should we amend now and then complete a PRO1 with the statement that it started 8/18?
Yes, I think that would be a good recommendation to go with that, and make sure you're clearly communicating with the parents that you do not have a licensed special education administrator or professional providing those services. Because you will be found non-compliant if you do not.
The next question is clarification. We cannot list the gen ed teacher as one of the personnel providing SDI in the co-teaching environment, ? We have always listed them in one box and the IS in another box for that goal in the co-teaching classroom.
You need to have this. I was very excited when they shared language of what that should look like in the supports for school personnel. That's why I literally copied it and put it over here. And I didn't put this in Kim language. I put this in language that was given to us from somebody from ODE. So if that is happening, you need to have that support for school personnel, because the law clearly states that a special education professional has to oversee the specially designed instruction. There are definitely times for sure where your general education teacher may be helping with some of that, especially with some of your behavior related goals.
So does this become a blanket statement for all IEPs for the support for school personnel, since you aren't going to amend the IEP for a 1 week substitute teacher?
I wouldn't do 1 week. I would say long-term. We're talking about a long-term. We're talking about somebody being out for, maybe your intervention specialist is out because they had their knee replaced. We're not talking about a 1 week. A 1 week, you should be able to make up those service minutes that may have been missed. But no, we are never talking in an IEP about blanket statements at any point in time. So when you think about that long-term, so when you think about that, maternity leaves are typically anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks. Surgeries are anywhere between a month or longer. That's what you want to think about, that long term. If you are unable to provide those services from your intervention specialists you currently have on staff.
If a sub becomes certified throughout the year, do all IEPs need to be amended to take out the change in support for school personnel?
Yes, because you have to be very clear with who's providing it and how.
You may have sort of already answered this, but in my district, we have a couple classrooms that are sort of co-teaching environments. I have some where we have paraprofessionals in a self-contained room, and they might be assisting with different activities with students. my question becomes, this language at the bottom, is that something we could write in a way that encompasses all of those scenarios? Like I was imagining the general educator, long-term sub, in a, like, will collaborate with the intervention specialist in assisting with delivery of specially designed instruction. Is there a way to just do it that way for those kids where that's applicable? Or do I really need to write it for each specific circumstance?
You would need to write it for each specific circumstance because a parent needs to know who's providing that service. If you just have the list of this, or this, nobody really knows who's providing that service.
I was afraid that's what you were going to say, but thank you for
Sorry.
bringing that up. Appreciate it.
Do we need to amend the document if they are on maternity leave?
It depends who's providing their specially designed instruction. I know in my former position as a director of special education, when I knew somebody was going out on maternity leave, I met with my intervention specialists and we figured out if we were able to cover the current amount of minutes and at what capacity with our current staff and shift around duties and other aspects within the building. So if you don't have a licensed intervention specialist, so if your substitute teacher is holding an intervention specialist license, then that's fine. You wouldn't have to amend anything because it is a licensed special education professional. The substitute teacher one would be if somebody does not hold that license. That's why we don't put individual names of people. We put titles of positions.
And then the last question I see in here right now is I have an intervention specialist that is working on an alternative license with IEP students under the mentorship of another intervention teacher. This should be noted as support for school personnel.
Correct. Because if they're working on their alternative license, they are not a licensed intervention specialist as of this point. And then as soon as they get that license, then you should look at amending the IEPs. And the parents need to be notified that the person instructing their child is not currently a licensed intervention specialist. Section 8 talks about transportation as a related service. So when we think about those, there's another series of questions that are asked. When we talk about special transportation, it is travel to and from school or between schools. We talk about that specialized equipment, so ramps, lifts, adapted vehicles, whatever that might be, if they need to be on a van instead of a traditional school bus. If you're fitting or retrofitting a vehicle with specialized equipment, so if there's integrated seat or safety vests, if there needs to be a bus aid that's employed, remember, that's why you have district reps, because these are expensive. Transportation can cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. That's why this district rep needs to know the fiscal parts of this as well to approve these. If they need alternative pickup and drop off locations, oftentimes we will see this as like curb to curb, especially in a more urban or suburban area where kids are expected to walk to stops, like community stops. A student might need curb to curb, or any other travel that may need to be arranged by the school district with no reimbursement from the state. So when you thinking about all of these pieces. So does the child require special transportation? If that answer is yes, that would be one of those things we just talked about. Sorry. Does the child need transportation to and from services? So these would be services that the school has deemed that this child is in need of, but they cannot provide them within their current setting. So if the school were to say that a child needs mental health counseling and there is not a mental health counselor at the school, they may need to provide that service to and from. That's why you have to be very cautious in the words that we use when we're in these meetings. And then does the child need accommodations or modifications for that transportation? If you're checking yes, look at what those are. Does the bus driver need to be notified of a child's behavioral and or medical concerns? Notice this is one kid right here. So if we have a child with behaviors and the bus driver needs to be aware, especially if you've identified triggers, then you would want to check yes. We don't want to just blanket tell every bus driver about every kid's information. That's going to leave your district open to a huge legal obligation or potentially lawsuits if you disclose too much information to too broad of a group. If a student needs that aid, that one-to-one aid, then you would say that they need specialized transportation as far as that. So if they need any of those accommodations, you may need to put an accommodation that a student has preferential seating. Maybe it means that they need to be in the front seat. Maybe it needs to be that they sit in a seat by themselves at all times. That's an IEP team decision to make that.
There's a question on if you could give a little bit more clarification on what is the criteria for requires special transportation.
It would be anything that every other student doesn't have access to. So if every other student is being given that whatever you're wanting to give to you feel that the student with the identified disability has, then that would not be specialized transportation. Anything else outside of that would require special transportation. So if you are, for example, maybe you're placing your students from your school setting into a classroom in another building, that would require special transportation, because that's not what would typically be happening if they were not needing that specialized instruction in a different location.
Are we required to drive down a student's lane to load and unload, or is the parent responsible for getting them down and back the lane?
We cannot, if a child needs door to door, they could win.
A district is required to get that child to school. So for instance, an example is in my previous district, a student lived down a long lane that was gravel, and the bus would get stuck because there wasn't enough gravel. The district ended up having to lay gravel down, and the cost of the gravel had to get laid down because the district was required to physically pick up that student at their door because of their wheelchair. So check with your legal is what I'm going to recommend. You know, what is legal able to back you up on? You know, do they feel confident enough that you can say parent has to bring them down the driveway or down the lane? If legal's confident in that, then I would stick with whatever they're saying.
If a student's IEP is written for them to be provided SPL services, preschool is full, student ability isn't appropriate, and the parent says that they can't get the student to the school because of whatever reason, does transportation need to be offered to bring them to the school if we aren't doing home visits, or would the parents deny services?
Well, you can't force a parent to deny services. So that is theirs. If the school has identified the need to provide some kind of specially designed instruction, even in the areas of speech and language, the district has an obligation to figure out how to provide those services. So yes, a district may need to transport a student to and from school to get those services. So that would just be that school district's determination on how that would work. So looking right here, and I'm also watching the time. So Erin is a student with a learning disability that requires extensive reading support at school. Her IEP has multiple goals in the area of reading. This past school year, she has begun demonstrating severe anxiety and has very adverse reactions in large social settings, including hallways and on the bus. The IEP team has amended her IEP to include classroom and bus accommodations to minimize her activity. So how would you document this in Section 8? So number 1, does the child require special transportation? That answer is going to be no. Does the child need transportation to and from services? That also is going to be no based off of this information. Number 3, does the child need accommodations or modifications for transportation? We have listed up here that the IEP team has amended her IEP to include classroom and bus accommodations to minimize her anxiety. So that answer would be yes here. So what do we need to do next? We would need to make sure that since the IEP has been updated to include bus accommodations, our next step would be to make sure we clarify what those accommodations are and clearly communicate to the driver what those accommodations are, because the driver is responsible for providing those accommodations, depending how they're listed on that. On the IEP. Non-academic and extracurricular activities. So in what ways will the child have the opportunity to participate in the non-academic or extracurricular activities with their non-disabled peers? You may need to put in here that a student may need accommodations for any type of school sanctioned event. For example, if they have one-to-one support while at school, they may also need that one-to-one support at sporting events or dances or after school clubs. So that might be what they may need to make sure they still have the opportunity to participate the same as their non-disabled peers. If a student is provided notes or allowed extra review time of material, they may need that same level if they're participating in any kind of sports or anything outside of the typical school day. The IEP does carry into those environments. And so another example would be if a student maybe plays the flute and wants to be in the marching band, but they're in a wheelchair, then they may need somebody listed as an accommodation, or in this section, how are they going to participate? They may need to have something written in here that somebody's pushing that wheelchair while the child marches. You cannot exclude them because of their disability. There are other reasons that a student may be excluded from non-academic and extracurricular, but we cannot exclude them because of their identified disabilities.
Just one question on that. I'm seeing some districts fill in the second blank with the wording, it will be the child/parent's choice to participate. Is anything needed to be written in this section if the first blank description is filled in?
Are you required to fill that in? I mean, and you really don't want to leave any sections blank. So finding some kind of language that your district can support is what I would say that you would standardize across your district to answer that one.
I also want to jump in here. A lot of school districts I've seen just have a blanket statement that they put that says child will have access to non-academic extracurricular activities as their same age peers. That's great. I'm glad that they have that opportunity, but really be cognizant for each individual student looking at their supports and accommodations throughout the day. Could they potentially need supports and accommodations for extracurriculars and non-academic activities? Any school sanctioned event. So going to a dance, having a after school event, something like that, that's the district is putting on, or even the classroom teacher is providing or putting on, that is included as well. So don't just put that blanket statement thinking, oh, we're good because this kid only has a specific learning disability. He doesn't need those kinds of supports. Really talk through it to figure out, does he or doesn't he?
Section 10 are the general factors. So when you think about this, you need to have this conversation. It is a conversation that everybody is talking at this point. And it's not asking your opinions if you think you have, it's just, have you considered this? So has the team considered the strengths of the child, for example? Instead of asking some of those, Mom, did you feel that we discussed your strengths? Or do you feel we addressed your concerns? Or did we share the results of the most recent evaluation? Instead of just reading those verbatim and what you would say, you may want to say, Mom, we discussed the strengths of your child back in the profile when we addressed what their needs were, or in the transition section. Redirect the team back to where you have already addressed these so that people can't say, no, we didn't do it. If you can't redirect where you've already had that conversation to answer these questions, all yes, then you know you need to go back and adjust something in the IEP. So make sure that you are able to answer those a little bit more in that present sense. Okay.
Some people also, I'll be in meetings and they'll say, we're going to come back to section 10 at the end of the meeting. And there's really no point in coming back to it, because if you look at those individual questions, you have already addressed it. You have already discussed it up to section 10. You don't have to wait until you're ready to sign the document in order to address these questions.
And that piece right there about regarding the third grade reading guarantee, is the child on track for reading? If they have a RIMP, they are not on track. That's why they have a RIMP. So there's your good answer for yes or no. Section 11, the least restrictive environment. When determining your LRE, the IEP team needs to consider why the student requires services outside of the regular education setting without accommodations, why SDI cannot be provided in the general education with typically developing peers with supplementary aids and or services. And it needs to be based on the individual needs of the child, not the child's disability. Make sure you're being very specific with these statements and ensure the IEP team addresses all areas of SDI and those related services. So when we think about these different codes like the IE13, IE14, IE15, when we have to identify those for our students, special education outside of the regular class is less than 21% of the day. So a student with a disability receiving those special education and special education services outside of the regular classroom for less than 21% of the day, you may need to go in and actually, well, you will have to go and do this. You will need to calculate the amount of minutes during your school day and instructional periods. So make sure that you think about all of your, as administrators here in this call, you need to think about all of your minutes in all of your different settings. So what it looks like in a kindergarten classroom may look different than it does in a 5th grade classroom, that may look different than it does with high school students. So think about that within your organization and your district.
Yeah, if you could clarify a little bit for me, when we're calculating the minutes, a lot of discussion is surrounding, like, do we calculate only content area classes? Do we calculate all areas where the district has decided to place the student into a setting? Do we calculate recess? Do we calculate, or do we leave recess out? Do we calculate lunch? Do we leave lunch out? And I'm not really sure where to move from that at this moment, because it came up yesterday, and we have, for instance, we have a student who, because of her situation, can't attend lunch. So, that would be away from her peers, but we'd also been advised not to calculate lunch at one point. So I'm just curious where we're at with it. Do all the minutes count if it's on their schedule? How does that work?
From my understanding, and we can get additional clarification as that as well. So if you can put that in the chat, even though we're going to reply that, we're going to make sure we get that, just so we capture that thought. If a student is not attending lunch and that's in their IEP, they're now being excluded from their typical peers. So that would count in their minutes. So it's anytime they're being excluded from their typical peers.
And that's kind of how we've addressed it. So, like, if we create any kind of schedule for the student, and we, like, the team or the district makes a decision in any environment to not include them with typical peers, then we calculate all minutes that are scheduled, but then like, for instance, at the high school, we would subtract the minutes in between classes since those are not scheduled.
And it would depend, because if you have a student that you're not allowing to go in the hallway because of behavior, now they're being excluded from their typical peers.
So would we calculate, like, in that case, then we would add, like, we would not consider those minutes, or we should include all minutes, like, from the moment the school starts to the moment that school ends?
Put that in the chat so we can clarify. I want to make sure we're giving you the most accurate guidance on that one. I know what I think in my head, but I want to make sure I'm giving you the right guidance. So if you don't mind putting that in the chat, just so we capture it when we get the transcript from our chat.
Problem.
Thank you.
Can I just add something real quick, Kim?
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that the students are gen ed students first, and as much as possible, they should be educated in the general education classroom. I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat just surrounding, like, resource room and things like that. And only the students with the most significant needs and disabilities should be pulled out into a resource room to be instructed. As much as possible, all students should be receiving their instruction in the gen ed classroom, because they are still required to take those state tests with those state standards. And we should be pushing our resources into that gen ed classroom.
When we talk about statewide and district testing, when we move into this area here, if the IEP team answers yes to the child is participating in the alternate assessment, it is required that you complete the assessment participation decision-making tool. And you have to do that annually. You can't make the determination they're going to be alternately assessed one time, and it's always the case. You must reevaluate this annually. Make sure that you're fully using the tool that takes you all the way through the pathway, where you're answering all the different questions. If you're unsure what document I'm looking for or what I'm referring to, just go out to ODE's site and look at that decision-making tool. It's got stop signs and go signs and caution signs, all of those pieces. It's very clear. It clarifies very easily which students should or should not be taking the alternate assessment. And it's a very small percentage. I'm sure you're all aware that it is supposed to be less than 1% of our state population taking that assessment. Section 12 needs to be filled out every year and only for the relevant tests to be taken during that year. Please remember, especially in high school, when you get into those end of course assessments, there may be times that you're listing 2 in a content area, such as algebra 1 and geometry, especially if a student had not met competency and the plan during that next year is to receive the intervention and take that assessment again. Be very clear in the assessment title for your state test exactly what the tests are that the student will be taking. If they've not taken any in a content area, it is okay to leave that blank. So if they have already taken biology as a freshman or a sophomore and they're in their junior or senior year, you could leave biology out. Same thing, you know, science is only in 5th and 8th grade before biology. So you wouldn't have science listed as any state tested areas in other grade levels. The other tests that you could have your district wide might be like your Terra Nova, iReady, any kind of district-based assessments that your district provides. That's what goes in your district testing. Remember, for tests like the ACT, SAT, you cannot automatically provide accommodations. They have to be provided by the college board. So making sure you're very clear in the accommodations that are needed for students on this testing page for the other testable areas, then you would need to, whoever is responsible for that in your district, sometimes it's a school counselor, sometimes it's a building principal or assistant principal, curriculum director, find out whoever it is in your district that handles that so that you can apply for accommodations on the ACT or SAT for any of your students. Those come back directly from the college board that tell what you can and cannot provide services in. When you get into the exemptions, section 13 exemptions, under that 3rd grade reading guarantee, there is guidance that those are changing. You need to get out there and read that new guidance. There are some webinars talking about what that change looks like. So if you go onto ODE's site and look up literacy or 3rd grade reading guarantee, you're going to find access to those. Students beyond 3rd grade, not reading on grade level, are going to continue with RIMPs if they have not hit their grade level standards and they have been exempted from that 3rd grade reading guarantee provision. We are waiting to get more clarification on exactly how that's being rolled out. We don't have that clear guidance yet. We do know it's coming. So for students in grades K through 3, you need to make sure you're selecting that it is applicable for those students and then answer your next questions. So it's either applicable or it's not. It is applicable for your K3 students. If the student does have a significant cognitive disability, and you would say yes, then you can move on and you're done with the exemptions page. If you say no, you now need to answer what exemption is applicable for this IEP cycle. So this should be marked not to exempt for students in grades K to 2, and then potentially marked yes to exempt only in the 3rd grade, but not until after the attempts are completed. You don't want to exempt a student from the consequences of a test they haven't yet taken, because they may actually not need that exemption. And so as a district, you don't want to report inaccurately somebody being exempted and then count against your different state testing reporting pieces when a student could have hit that on their own. For high school end of course exams and the alternate assessment, remember that exemptions can only be considered after the students have participated in those assessments at least twice, with remediation between each attempt. So you cannot, gone are the days where people used to exempt at the beginning of their freshman year. I never understood why, but it did happen. You want to wait and exempt as late as possible in their high school career to give those students every opportunity to pass those exams, or especially in the high school, to find alternate competency outside of the high school exams to work towards their graduation. Look at those alternative pathways. Remember, especially in the high school, if you exempt too early, it will impact your students and your district and federal graduation status. And then there are all types of other elements to that if you are not working towards or not achieving the expectations for federal graduation standards. Once again, remember, there are alternative pathways that students could be eligible for outside of these end of course assessments. All right, on your section 14, in your meeting participants page, your required team members are the student, for any of those students who are 14 years and older. Remember, 14 through 17, they need to be invited. 18, they are required. Your parent should be one of your team members. A general education teacher who actually works with the student. Your intervention specialist working with the student, and your district rep. If you have someone who is not able to come, such as your intervention or as a related service staff member, and they needed to be excused from the meeting, they still need to have the information. They still need to be signing off on this, and there needs to be an excusal form put in place as well. Remember, also at the top, when you're choosing how the meeting was held, that is based on how the parent participates. It's not about how the team participates. So if the bulk of the team is sitting around the table and the parent is on a phone, then the meeting was held based as a telephone conference, because that's how the parent participated. And then that must go in your prior written notice. Especially coming out of COVID, there has been a lot of guidance given with that every prior written notice should include how the meeting was held. So if it was virtual, if it was face-to-face, if it was held via phone, getting that information in there, because before, almost all of our meetings were face-to-face, and now they're all different types of methods. So make sure that you're putting that in your prior written notice. And then double check that your dates, your IEP effective dates, align with what's on your cover page. That does all get reported into your EMIS. That does impact funding. It impacts a lot of elements if those dates are not accurate. And make sure you don't have any dates out of compliance, because that will also find you non-compliant. And you don't really want OEC coming in to monitor all of the parts that you're working on. Section 15 is your signatures. So that very top piece in that initial IEP, if you remember this morning, for those of you who participated with us this morning, and we talked about the ETR, and a parent says, but I don't think my child has an educational disability. And they disagreed, and they wrote their letter of disagreement. But the district still feels that they would qualify for services. You need to write the initial IEP, and then the parent has the option in that third box down in this first section, in that parent guardian signature, to say, I do not give consent for special education and related services at this time. So the parent still has the right to say, I don't want services. They also have the right to initiate special education related services in the IEP. Or they could say, I don't want it for my child in a particular area. Maybe they don't want them to receive occupational therapy. They have the ability to do that. For an annual review, you need to make sure that you're choosing or directing the parents to the correct section. Is it an IEP annual review, not a change of placement? Or is it an IEP review, change of placement? Make sure they're signing the right one. Please note, though, that if it's not a change of placement, does not require that parent signature to implement the IEP. The initial IEP requires the signature, and the change of placement. Change of placement isn't just about the physical location of where a child's receiving services. When we talked in the LRE about IE 13, 14, or 15. If a student was under that 21% and they're identified as like an IE 13 student, and now you're intensifying services and they're going to have more time removed from their peers, and they're going to spend more time with an intervention specialist, we're increasing services, they may move into that IE 14. So that is important to know when you think about what change of placement. It's not just where their rear end is seated for a certain amount of time. It's actually about the amount of time they spend with their typical peers. So if they're moving from one gen ed biology class to another gen ed biology class, that's not a change of placement. However, if they happen to be in a gen ed biology class and now they're going into a resource room biology class and it's putting them over that amount of minutes, that's why calculating those minutes is so important. That absolutely could become a change of placement depending upon those minutes.
Kim, even if it does not change the 13, 14, or 15, it would still be a change of placement, correct? If you're removing them from a gen ed classroom and putting them in a resource room, you're removing them from that environment.
It would depend whatever their previous IEP states. I think that's what you're asking, right?
Yes.
For those signatures, on the second page of the signatures, you're required to give parents a copy of the procedural safeguards notice at the IEP meeting or at some time annually. They must have it at every time, have it at least once annually. Best practice is to provide it every time you're meeting. A parent may choose not to take it. They may say, I have enough of these at home. I've had several parents say, I could wallpaper my entire house with these documents. So they may choose not to say it. Notice it says that you are providing it. A parent has the option to not walk out of the room with it in their hand. So they are receiving a copy of those procedural safeguards. If they didn't get them at the IEP meeting, make sure you know when you gave them. Make sure you have that documented somewhere where they received that. The transfer of rights at majority, this middle section, it has to be signed prior to the child's 17th birthday. So we're doing this when they're 16. And we start talking about with the child's parent or surrogate or guardian that the child and the parent receive a copy of those procedural safeguard notices, informing them of the transfer of rights. Remember, at 18, a student now kind of moves into the driver's seat. When you think about a little bit of their IEP, kind of like a car, right? The parents are still maybe own the car, but they're not driving it anymore. It is the student who gets to make all the decisions. So a parent should still be invited. However, they are not the required team member now. Now we've moved into the student being that member. So make sure you're explaining to the parents what that looks like. Notice there is a signature line for both the child and the parent, that they understand their rights, the transfer of rights at the age of majority. And then the copy of the IEP. Did the parents receive a copy of the IEP at the meeting? It's a yes or a no. If they did not get it at the meeting, when did they receive it? And sometimes they may not have received it physically at the meeting. Maybe they were virtually and the rest of the team was in the room, and you're going to email it later that day or the next morning, depending on when those meetings are. Make sure you're very clear on when they received that. And they also, by the way, on that one, make sure they have a copy of the new IEP prior to the previous one expiring. So you really do have to watch those days and times. So children who have visual impairments, there is a very specific form, and these are used for those children who have a visual impairment. And a visual impairment is identified as including blindness, which means impairment in vision that even with correction adversely affects a child's educational performance. So we're not just talking about a student who maybe wears glasses that can see some things well without their glasses. We're talking about those students that are closer to or with that blindness. So we don't use this section very often. And then the last slide before I jump to our survey, because I now have 3 minutes. As an administrator, how do you ensure that IEPs are compliant with the law? In your district, in your building, whoever you are servicing, make sure that you establish a clear review process. What are your processes to review that your IEPs are compliant, that all of the areas are meeting legal timelines and they have the required elements? You should develop an internal monitoring team. We are going to be working with some teams throughout our region this year with an internal monitoring, and we're doing some internal monitoring coaching, and then depending on our interest, that may be something we look to expand in the future. Make sure that when you're reviewing these as the administrator, you're providing timely feedback to your staff. If you don't review documents and provide them feedback to improve their craft, they're not going to be able to improve their craft. And then you're opening yourself up for potential of multiple different legal concerns that come with that. Make sure as the district rep, as the administrator, you are actively engaging in the meetings. Know the students, know the parents, know the strengths of your staff so that you can, and know the resources available within your district. And then make sure you are staying up to date with current laws. If you are not, this is my little plug for an outside organization. If you are not currently a member of OAPSA, I highly encourage you, which is the Ohio Association of Public School Administrators. I highly encourage you to become a member of that organization, whether you have to pay independently or if your district will provide those service or that service for you. They really stay up to date and send out almost daily communications with anything that is changing. And don't forget, you can follow us on social media. That's where you'll find all of our additional professional development opportunities we provide. We also, if you are a district that requires more intensive services, if you're a CSI, if you have CSI schools, TSI schools, ATSI schools, you can actually request kind of more of a one-on-one or district-specific professional learning through our website at the sst.11.org. There's a professional learning request tab at the top of that page as well. Those of you who have been with us all afternoon and all morning, thank you so very much. We appreciate you being here.